Welcome to Critical Questions, where we discuss hot topic issues affecting American Muslims and Muslims around the world. Today, we're going to talk about the socio-political context surrounding France's relationship with its Muslim population. This relationship has come under increasing strain over the past couple of decades for a variety of different factors, among them being successive French governments' efforts to assimilate its Muslim population, and also the rising tide of Muslim extremist violence that has killed more than 260 people since 2012. Just last month, on October 6th, a young Chechen Muslim beheaded Samuel Paty, a high school teacher who had shown his students caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad in his freedom of expression class. 2 weeks later, a Tunisian man brutally murdered 3 worshippers at the Notre Dame Basilica in Nice. Tensions are once again at an all-time high. To help us understand this fraught relationship between France and its French Muslim community, we are joined today by Dr. Jocelyne Cesari, currently an associate professor of the practice of religion, peace and conflict resolution at the Department of Government at Georgetown University. She also teaches contemporary Islam at the Harvard Divinity School and directs the Harvard Interfaculty Program Islam in the West. She is the author of numerous books, including When Islam and Democracy Meet, Muslims in Europe and in the United States, which is a reference in the study of European Islam and integration of Muslim minorities in secular democracies. Dr. Cesari, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be able to join you on this session. Thank you.
Okay, so Dr. Cesari, France has the largest Muslim population in Western Europe. There are approximately 5.7 million Muslims in France, and they form about 8.8% of the French population. Could you give us a brief historical overview of France's relationship with its Muslim citizens and how it has evolved over time?
So the presence of Muslims in France is directly related to the colonial and post-colonial past of France, in the sense that most of the Muslims present on the French soil come from North Africa, mostly Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and they are directly related to the connection first of France with its colonies, because we tend to forget that the first workers came as single workers, left their family behind, when Algeria was still French, in the sense that Algeria was 3 French departments, like you would say today, Lyon, Paris, you know. So there was a territorial continuity that put Algeria on the same administrative level than continental France. So when they came, they were French national. And they were not seen as immigrants as such, but the flux and circulation between North Africa and France started really between the 2 world wars. It became more intense after 1974. 1974 is an important date. It's the moment where the immigration based on labor will stop between the Second World War and 1974. North African people came to France to rebuild France after the war. And again, they didn't come as migrants. The term migrant was not even used. There were supposed to be a temporary labor force that was going back to their countries of origin. And during this period, Algeria became independent in 1962. So you see the relationship goes for a long, long time. And in 1974, the labor migration is stopped in Europe. And so you do not have any more people coming on construction site or for other kind of labor tasks. You have families that are reunited on the French soil. And that's where you see a tilt, a shift in the perception of Muslims. For a while, they were never Muslim. They were single workers. They were colonial subject. Then they became North African immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And the term Islam was never articulated ever, while they were Muslims. When I started my PhD, the first thing I did was to go and interview the first generation, and they'd never been asked, what is to be a Muslim, while they were observant people, but it was invisible to the French eye. So you move one decade or 2 decades more, you have 1989, when the children of this generation start going to school in France. And that's where the hijab crisis starts, because they go with a hijab and there is no kind of provocation in it. It's just they are observant Muslims, but they've never been perceived as such. And this makes the French panic, because they are educated, all of them, on a very strict separation of private and public. And they could not understand, and I see they still don't understand, that you can be a good citizen and a good believer.
Right.
For them, they saw that as a lack of integration, while it was the opposite. If these young women were wearing the hijab in school, it meant that they considered that there are no problem being French and being Muslim, observant Muslim, and they saw it the opposite. And since then, the debate has become more and more intensified on the question of Islam and laicite. So we have moved from immigration to socioeconomic issues to now the question of religion. And
Right.
that's why it's very heavy for Muslims, because all of these dimensions have added up. They have not, I would say, disappeared or faded away. And so the moment you step out of your house, you are a Muslim in France, you are scrutinized for all these reasons, because you look North African, because you have an immigrant background, because you may dress in a way that shows your religiosity. So all this will make your daily interactions very, very challenging. Even if you are not even so religious, you cannot avoid the question of Islam if you have a Muslim background in France. And so, and not in a positive way. It's always, you have to justify yourself and to defend yourself. And I think we underestimate this continuous pressure on the shoulders, especially of the new generation.
Right. And Dr. Cesari, you mentioned laicite. And yes, France does have a very strong tradition of the separation of church and state. But increasingly now, because of some of the things that you just mentioned, France comes across as a country that does not just promote secularism, but is actively anti-religion and especially anti-Islamic. And when you mentioned the hijabs, Muslim girls not being allowed to wear the headscarf because due to a 2004 law in their public schools, it's not so much a matter of religious expression as it is a matter of religious obligation for a lot of Muslims. And I'm wondering, one, if you could talk to that, and also have other religious communities. I mean, for instance, the Jewish community, men who wear yarmulkes or nuns who wear crosses, have they also experienced that same kind of stifling of their religious expression? And how have they dealt with it? If you could speak to that.
So we are in an American context, so it's very important. I try to explain how the French secularism is different from the American one. And interestingly, Macron is right now having a lots of challenge to try to talk with the Anglo-American counterpart, not only media, but also political actors. So there are two aspects of secularism, and we tend to consider them similar while they are not. The first one is the relationship of the state with all religious organizations. So in America and in France, there is a separation, okay? These are the only two countries in the world that separate, which means that you can achieve the same level of secular interaction without automatically separating. You can cooperate, you can interact, but you have to do it in fairness with all religious groups. If you do not treat all of them the same way, that it's not secular. And you do not interfere into their doctrine, management, organization. At the same time, no religious organization should try to take the state agenda or to transform the state agenda for its own purpose. So you have this continuous tension, which means that it's more secularization than secularism as a fixed moment, because even in the US today, you can say, or you can observe that some religious groups are trying to take the state agenda for their own purpose. So the balance is always difficult. The French operate under the misguided assumption that the separation that was inscribed in the law of 1905 means that no religious activities are allowed in the public space. But these are two different levels, and that's where America differs from France. The institutional separation in America doesn't preclude the legitimacy of religion in social interaction. Quite the opposite, actually. When Tocqueville, French philosopher, came to America, that's the first thing he noticed, that congregation were an active, important element of civic life. The French are educated on the opposite way, because the past is very heavy in shaping this political culture. There is a war of religion, and Catholic and Protestants killing each other in the street. So it meant that French people are educated by thinking that religion in public space is trouble. It is not good, ever good. While in America, we are educated in an opposite way. Religion in society is good.
Right. And religious expression is considered part of this freedom of expression. And it almost seems as if, you know, Macron sort of, after these brutal killings last month, he asserted very aggressively the right to blaspheme. And he said that this is a French right to freedom of expression, and it's the French right to blaspheme. And yet, it feels that, you know, when it comes to this, you know, the freedom of expression, it doesn't extend to religion or religious practice at all.
Because again, that's the past that the French state and the political education of elites in France, political one, economic, media, and academic, to carry that religion is trouble. It has to be contained. So the vision of the public space in France is, it's okay, you can have places of worship. If you don't, you're not even a democracy. So this is a given. But you cannot express yourself as a citizen, let's say in multiple social action, on the name of religion, because it's seen as a breach in the social contract. And that goes back to the continuous fight of the French state against the Catholic Church that was seen as anti-republic, anti-democratic. And so you have this idea that you need to fight against religion in order to exist as a rational, free citizen. And so this has carried in the way that the French institutions are dealing with religion. There is always a temptation and need to control them, and to limit them in the way that they will interact in the public space. So all religious groups, let's be clear, have things to do, I would say, outside the home and outside the place of worship. What has happened is that the Catholic in France have gone through this process of disciplinization. And it took a century to the French Catholic to be molded this way, you know.
Right. What about the Jewish community, though? How?
The Jewish community is the same thing. The French state ideally wants each religion to have a sort of hierarchical organization to which the state can talk, which is not the American way at all.
Right.
So it goes back to this model of church and state relations. And so Napoleon was the first one, or Bonaparte, and then Napoleon was the first one to try to bring rabbis together in order to show that they could live as Jews under the French national law. And it's interesting because the questions that were asked to them at the time are exactly the same that are asked to Muslims today, meaning, is the allegiance to your religion undermining your allegiance or loyalty to France? So they had to respond to this question, which from an American point of view is obviously a breach of the secular culture. So,
absolutely.
So that's the kind of interference or influence that the state hopes to have with religion in order to make them fit in this very top down approach that makes the state needs religious authority like churches, you know. So they did that for Judaism, and that's what they have tried to do for Islam since the 90s, until they created a representative body of Islam in France. And it has really been possible because the state pushed for it, not Muslim groups, the state. So
and could you tell us a little bit more about this representative Islamic body in France, and who what it's made of, and and what is their relation to the Muslim community in general? Does the Muslim community in general in France recognize them as a legitimate authority?
So again, it came from the goal of the state to have a representative interlocutor for all issues, because again, the state takes on a lot of legislation that can affect worship. So like they talk to the cardinal or to the chief rabbi, they want a sort of chief mufti. So it happened that when the French authorities started to realize that that was not an immigration anymore, that you had young Muslim citizens of France, and so you needed some kind of organization. So the conversation starts in the 90s, and of course they're going to encounter a vast network of different associations that do not want to be put together under one umbrella organization.
Right.
And that will not see it in a I would say very positive eye. And then the landscape of Islam in France is still very much influenced by some countries of origin that have a strong, long-standing relationship with France, like Morocco, Algeria, and to a certain extent Turkey. And so what they do when people need religious goods, so to speak, like imam during the month of Ramadan, or literature for the mosque, or they send their personnel. They send their imams from Algeria, from Morocco, Tunisia. Wow. There is this proximity that plays a role. So for a while, the French state thought that talking to Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia was a way to regulate Islam. When the new generation became more vocal, it was clear that these states didn't represent the reality of French Islam. And so they start looking into organization associations, and they came with a sort of agreement where this association would come together around the table, exactly like Napoleon did with the rabbi. Sarkozy was the one on which this organization finally came up. He put them all together in a castle, a palace, and he said to them, we're going to work together on an agreement to create this new representative body. And so the tensions have always been there, first among this conglomeration of associations. They do not all agree, and some groups tend to want to supersede others, and the international influence are still there. You have the one supported by Morocco, the one supported by Algeria, the young French Muslims supported by nobody. So you have all these tensions still there.
Yeah.
And it happened that now the state has created an artificial bureaucratic elite of Muslims who have their legitimacy only because they belong to this organization. Wow. And they have no real influence on the education, the transmission of Islam for young people, which happen in different kind of setting, not automatically in mosque. And that's why you see very active transnational network like the Muslim Brothers, the Jamaat at-Tabligh, all these transnational networks that help to educate into Islam, you see.
Because there's a vacuum internally in terms of
Exactly.
schools. So religious schools and Islamic religious schools, are they not allowed to function?
Yes, they are, because in the French laicity, again, the precedent is the Catholic school. There was an agreement after Second World War. There was a need to recognize that Catholic contributed to the war effort. And so they were allowed to create private schools. And so you have a few Muslim schools, yes.
Okay.
They do exist, and they have been even more attractive to people since the 2004 law that prohibits religious signs in public school. So the young family tend to put their kids into the school where they are allowed to wear the headscarf.
Sure. Dr. Cesari, President Macron, especially in sort of response to, sort of some of the extremist violence that we've seen over the past few years, often makes references to Muslim separatism. And that gives the impression that the French Muslim community as a whole wants to be set apart from French society and is somehow averse to integration. Could you give us a more nuanced understanding of the varied nature of the French Muslim community and how they see themselves in relation to French society and integration into it?
Oh, there are lots of surveys that have been done that completely invalidate this vision. Actually, including some I have contributed to, that show that the majority of French Muslims are very happy with the secular nature of the state because they see it as an advantage coming from countries where the state is actually very again involved in controlling Islam. So they are very disappointed when they see the state doing the same thing in France. There is kind of surprise, like, I have gone through that, or my parents went through that in their countries of origin. So they do not wish a sort of assertive kind of state upon them. And they have said that they have seen the French space as a space of freedom to express themselves as believers. As some have said to me in interviews, if I want to be religious here, it's my choice. So I had to invest in my spirituality in a way that my parents or my older sister could not do, because they lived in an environment where it was part of being of the national political community, not in France. So they appreciate that. And we have surveys that show that most of them express loyalty, majority of them express loyalty to the French institutions. And the only institution that is not seen positively is the police. But if you ask about elected bodies, if you ask about judges or the legal system, they all say we are French. Actually, they have never experienced any other countries, now we are, for the Algerian, that is the oldest group present in France, some are fourth generation, and still they are singled out and looked at external figures. So this is the most painful thing for young people who think French, dream in France, do not have any idea of how to live in a Muslim country, and are still seen as external or foreigners. And it weighs heavily on them, yes.
Now, because of the recent violence, Macron and the French government, they responded, in trying to sort of curb radicalization in France. And how do you think that has affected? I mean, what do you think of those measures that they have taken? Because it's come under a lot of criticism that they've been very blanket in their approach to countering radicalization, not just looking at people who, have those criminal pasts and are extremists, but have sort of, approached the entire Muslim community as being suspect. So, I mean, how would you respond to that? And what do you think would have been a better way in sort of responding to this?
First, the position of Macron is not new. This has been happening in France at each, I would say, incident. It can even go back to 1995. There was a bombing in the metro in France, and the bomb was the bomber was a young Algerian or a young French with an Algerian background. And that's the moment that the French started all the security system that is still in place called Vigipirate, and it was never lifted ever. So, and at the time, I remember, carrying a Quran in your backpack could be seen as a proof or not a sign of evidence that you were a terrorist. So that's the kind of challenges that the Muslim had since the 90s. So of course, 9/11 made things even more intense. And so the separatism term is an unfortunate one, and that's why Macron has pedaled back on that. Because if you talk separatism, the more radical are not Muslims. You have territorial minorities in France, like the Corsicans, the Basques. Actually, lots of explosion, bombing come from this group. So if you start talking separative, you're going to be very careful here. That's why also the term has been pushed aside. But what is at stake in this particular vision is that Islam is by definition now, unfortunately, seen as incompatible with the French values. And that's a big problem, meaning it is not just being politically active. If you look like an assertive Muslim, you are also now suspected. So there was a moment where the French law was trying to push back on that. I remember that there was an imam. So again, this is in late 90s, early 2000, an imam, a Salafi imam in a French mosque who said openly in public that it's good to beat your wife. So he was expelled based on law enforcement report, based on a threat on French security. So at the time, we have a special system called administrative court. The administrative court said that's not right. There is no proof of conspiracy. He may not have a liberal discourse, but it doesn't mean that he is a threat to the French security.
Right.
So at the time, you still had an attempt by the court and the judge to moderate this position. Fortunately, we are now almost 20 years after that. You had, again, the increase of attacks from radical groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. So I would say that now, with the laws that Macron is trying to push on the bill agenda, you see clearly that he tries to make this kind of pushback by the law impossible. You see, and that's very, very dangerous because you need some kind of ponderation about what is act of speech. You can have tons of illiberal people, doesn't make them terrorists, it doesn't even make them uncivic. So, and the French have no more experience with strong conservative religious voices in the public space. That's also a big difference with America.
Right.
In Europe, when you have interviews about level of religiosity, most of Muslims across Europe say we are Muslim, we believe in God, and most of Europeans are here, So for me, this is the reason why the misunderstanding is there. When you have the same survey in in America, actually the Muslims are not the highest to say we believe, the Mormons are.
Right.
That's also part of the, I would say, less emotional or anxious way of looking at Islam that exists in the US. I mean, there is a whole diversity, and the very conservative group, this is not attached to Islam as such. So the situation is, how do we disconnect the ideology of Islamism with the practice of Islam? And that's a challenge for which law enforcement, political elite are not educated. They are not able to make this distinction on the ground. And that's a big issue right there.
That's a huge issue. And do you think that, you know, a public school system would be a place where this kind of conversation could be happening? But given that very sort of stringent separation where you can't even, you know, go to school in your, you know, a religious garb or what is very much a part of your Muslim identity, I think it stifles. While you, I mean, you can have a very, intense conversations around the freedom of expression in which you show caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad, which are deeply provocative, but you can't have conversations around religious discourse and what's and Dr. Cesari, I mean, when it comes to freedom of speech, France also has a very strange sort of approach to it, right? Because it's not that freedom of speech is sacrosanct. There's certain things that you are not allowed to say. For instance, until very recently, criticizing the French president was a criminal offense until 2013, when the European Human Rights Court changed that. You know, burning the French flag, denying the Holocaust, these are all criminal offenses. But, you know, showing caricatures of the Prophet and then also amplifying and projecting them on government buildings in Paris is somehow protected. So, you know, so there's to the outside world, it just seems a little bit sort of
unbalanced
standard.
Yeah. So again, you're absolutely right. Freedom of speech, not only in France, but across Europe, is limited based on racial hatred and negation of the Holocaust. Obviously, it's a heavy past of Europe during World War II. So if you deny the Holocaust, for example, you can be fined, and depending on the gravity of the negation, you can even go to jail or lose your job. There are lots of limitations of this kind. The paradox is that people in France see the freedom of speech as anti-religious, meaning, again, the tradition of caricature, I'm not talking only about the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, I'm talking about the caricature as a political expression in France. You can trace it back since even before the First World War. And you see emerging that the priest, the cardinal, the Catholic Church is always depicted in very insulting terms. Mm-hmm. That would not be accepted in another environment. Why? Because there is this kind of zero-sum game. The French see the religion as the attacker, the hostile force, right, which they have to be protected. And indeed, if you look at the political history of the Catholic Church in France, it's true that they were always on the side, at least until the end of the First World War, they were always on the side of the monarchy, the despot, the absolutist. So there is this idea we cannot trust them, and we have to educate our children, new citizens, away from the Catholic influence.
Right.
What does it mean? It means that the public school was seen as a major place to create the new rational thinking of the new citizens and the new generation that would not question republic or democracy. So it meant that religion was off limit. You could not talk about religion in public school. That's why the French had never had even a religious instruction, while it's very common all across Europe. You cannot even really discuss religion because it will end up in some kind of always tensions, you know. So religion has been put off the curriculum, which is a big mistake, because the young generation do not get any religious education anymore. They are not fluent even with their Western European background. You know, how can you teach about history, arts, culture without looking at religion? And when it comes to Islam, it's even worse, in the sense that Islam doesn't appear really. There is a mention of the colonial war and post-colonial period, but Islam is never presented as part of the fabric of French society. And it's also a big issue. So you see here emerging the condition for putting Islam on the spot all the time in terms of making fun of the clerical establishment. You know, there is this idea that the cleric are hypocritical, that they never really express authentic opinions or beliefs. And so all these cliches and stereotypes have moved to the Muslims. And so to make fun of Islam is seen by the French as a sign of strong civil society. So they expect the believers of the faith to join them. That's a sign like you are integrated. And so they do not accept that the Muslims can even feel offended. It is not even possible to say you are offended. And that's a big problem here. So because the Muslim could use the legislation we just talked about racial hatred, they could say this is not caricature, this is not freedom of speech, this is direct attack on a particular group and a particular religion. And by the law, they are completely entitled to do that. When they have done that at the moment of the cartoons crisis, the Danish cartoons crisis, the judge didn't hear them, didn't listen to them. You know, when the Catholic Church, there was on the outskirts of Paris, commercial board, I don't know for which Italian fashion designer, and he was representing or displaying his clothes as the Last Supper of Christ. And so all the models were in different stage of nakedness. And so the Catholic Church said, we are offended. The judge could hear them because there is a sort of familiarity or culture. If a Muslim would say that, no, it cannot be accepted. And that's the problem here.
So given this animosity towards religion that is sort of based in historical, relations that the French society has had with the Catholic Church, what do you think is the future of French Muslims who are religious, who are observant, and are not just, expressing religion? They are doing this out of a matter of religious obligation, dressing up in a certain way or saying certain things in public. What do you think is the future of French Muslims in France? Where do you think this is going to go?
Oh, that's a tough question here, because to break this cycle, first you would need a lot of political courage from the political elite, and I don't see it at all, because it's much easier, that's what has been said about the Macron policy, to use the popular or public opinion that is indeed show lots of fear about Islam. So that's easy to do. So I would say you cannot rely on the state or political establishment. You as a citizen and a Muslim, what history shows is that you have to find alliance in the civil society. What is also very hard for Muslims is that they are the only one having this kind of interaction as a religious group with the state. Like, they are the only religious people, what they are not. So there is a need here to broaden up the discourse, as long as it's only about Islam. Indeed, the question of security, of terrorism, of immigration will come. But that's not the whole of it. It's not because you restrict freedom of worship that you're going to solve the security issue. And that's a discourse that has to be held by all religious groups today. It cannot just be the Muslim. And some Muslim leaders start to understand that. But it's hard to build this kind of alliance, you saw them emerging in states of emergency. Germany wanted to make circumcision illegal. Again, because there was the blindness here, we want to, control, that's about Islam, that's about the illiberal aspect of Islam. Who came up saying, but no, that's not about Islam, it's the Jewish population.
Jewish community, right, because they have that in common.
Exactly. The moment this connection happened, it was dropped. So there is a potential here, but there are lots of other variables that doesn't make it easy. It's like in America too, when there was some states wanted to prohibit Sharia, but in terms of civil law, it was not Sharia, it's state law. It was like marriage, divorce. So a Jewish community is kind of, no, you cannot do that because it's impinging on the civil
On
law
our
of
rights as
others.
well.
Yes.
Yes.
And then it drops. So I think there is a potential here. But
Have you seen such collaborations at all between the Jewish community and the Muslim community in France?
No, for obviously the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that weighs heavily. It's happening in Germany. It's very interesting to see how there been even an attempt to create not an ecumenical place, but a place that can be used by the two group of worshippers, because they have less problem. Both don't have, they prohibit representation. So that's easy to share the same space. You change the orientation, but that's the same space. While it's more challenging with the Christian. So you see this attempt emerging by the Muslim and Jewish elite in Germany.
But
not in France. And I think it's a big loss. Really big loss. And you need also the Sikhs. The Sikhs have been the one also targeted by the 2004 laws. They didn't, suddenly they could not wear the turban anymore.
And that's an integral part of their religious identity, to wear the turban.
But you see this kind of comparison that would completely deflate the kind of crispation around Islam is not happening as it should be in France. So the hope would be maybe to push it at the European level or to make it more transnational. But it's a big challenge. But history shows us that if you want your rights to be advanced, you need to build alliances. Think even of the civil rights movement here. It finally succeeded because segment of American society said it's enough.
Right, and we have many very, huge and very effective civil rights organizations here in the U.S., like the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and so many others. And the Muslim community has built alliances with them and with so many others. But is there a strong tradition of French civil rights organizations that the French Muslim community can be collaborating with?
Yes, they are, but they are very secular. They do not consider religious freedom as a legitimate or central component of this agenda. And that's the problem. That's the problem. So each time Muslims feel deprived, they do not find the same kind of solidarity that you would find here across other civil rights groups. That's true. That's a big issue. Yeah.
Sure. Well, Dr. Cesari, I can't thank you enough for your expertise, your analysis. I wish we could continue this conversation, but we've already taken so much of your time. Thank you so much for your expertise. And let's hope that the future of French Muslims is brighter than it has been, and that there will be coalitions and grassroots collaborations happening that will address some of the tensions that exist between the state and its Muslim community.
Thank you very much, Melacha. This was a pleasure. Bye-bye.